Well, thank you for two wonderful papers. I'm just going to make a few brief remarks and then we can sort of go to Q&A. I thought both of these papers did a great job of sort of problematizing the prominent narrative in which specific moments are highlighted as being these moments of trauma and of change, of sort of rupture, obviously, as the title of the conference alludes to. And so what we see in both of these papers is much more of this continuation, that a lot of the trends that we have associated in the historical narrative with a sort of post-67 moment actually had been going on for years before. And I think both of the papers highlighted that wonderfully, and also this tension between the political and the personal, and what sort of, as well as the local and the international. And I think what's interesting about sort of the 67 moment is how it can be looked at regionally, but also as how it was experienced within local context, right? So this panel specifically looking at Egypt and looking at the way that 67 had a particular meaning within an Egyptian context that maybe varied within a regional interpretation. Another thing that comes up, I think, also is this complicated relationship between the artists and the state that they're constantly negotiating. So that even when state sponsorship is present, and even when state patronage of the arts is the dominant form, we see these complicated negotiations of the artists and the ways in which they're intervening and reconsidering their ideological and political relationships to, in this case, the Nasserist regime. I thought Patrick's paper offered a wonderful comparison between different forms of cultural production, whether they be literary, cinematic, or in visual arts. One of the questions I had was what specifically is different about art, like what makes art different? So why art as opposed to literature, or why art as opposed to cinema? Is there something there that happens that is different to other forms of cultural production? So that was one of the, and is there also things that are no longer possible after a certain point? So we see these moments of continuation, but we also see these moments of fading out. And for example, within the literary context, we definitely see ways in which certain narrative structures no longer become sustainable after sort of into the 70s. So I'm wondering if you could sort of speak a little bit more to that. Another interesting connection I thought between the papers was this constant and persistent symbol of the woman as nation, and the ways in which that transforms, but the way that that also becomes unsustainable. The sort of national feminine becomes unsustainable as sort of prior to the war, but definitely after the war. And then we see this figure in the Gazzard painting that Patrick showed, where it's actually sort of death as opposed to the woman as nation. And both papers, I thought, spoke really well to that. And Alex's paper sort of touched upon this paternal relationship with the state, and so the ways in which there's a disillusionment and a disappointment that comes from an extension of these familial relationships. And I just wanted actually both of you to sort of speak a little bit more about what happens to this mother figure as we sort of go forward. I mean, this is just a sort of, this came up briefly, but it's like, I mean, 67 is talked about so frequently, in particular in sort of intellectual history, as being more than just a trauma, but as a disease, as something that is sort of infectious, and that is much more traumatic than, say, the encounter with, like, the encounter with colonialism or with Napoleon. That this is far worse, that it's sort of infectious in some ways. And I just was wondering if this comes up, this sort of motif of disease and infection comes up in the works that you've been looking at. So those were just a few thoughts. Turn it over to you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Tina, for these comments, and I think it raises a number of interesting directions to take it. I'm not one so keen on form And I know we have a lot of interesting discussions about that. I'm not a formalist in terms of art so much that it's a question of form dictating the content as a matter of choice. So I think the relation between literary exposition in this period and artistic representation, whether it's painting, sculpture, theater, is intertextual, and for a reason, because of these conflagration of crises and interactions. For instance, I think a question about what happened to the position of women. Yassim Abahia, Naguib Sarour's novel is a novel written in verse. So it's actually, a subtitle of it was a poetical novel, but it was also staged and presented in a very Egyptian way, with music, with Upper Egyptian folk songs, his very famous sort of Upper Egyptian songs. So it was very much intertextual, and I don't think it's limited by form in that way. And I don't see it as bound in that sense. And similarly, I think you see that Assaghini trying to inscribe text into his sculptures to eliminate ambiguity, it also references back to works he already knows are in play. And I think these works are all referencing each other's. I think Shaheen's documentary, which I haven't seen that one yet, but I read of it, and I know you can see it in Al-Asfur, this idea that he's wrestling with. He seems to be fully aware of these other kinds of movements and expositions taking place. So I see it as much more interrelated that way and not bound by form as a question. But I think, though, there is an interesting question about what happened to the form of painting and sculpture thereafter. And I kind of think it goes to the problem of what happened in art in the 70s. And this is just something I've been wrestling with, is I think the market changes. The state is disengaged from formal interest in the arts. The interest in plastic arts as a career, it was very hard to get into art schools in Cairo in the early 60s. I mean, there were people students would get personal appointments with Nasser in order to get into art school. It was kind of the thing to do in the late 50s, 60s, but no longer, I don't think it had that resonance by the 70s, and I think new forms of media have sort of moved on, and I think the role of art changes, and it becomes a form of consumption thereafter, a certain kind of consumption. You see the gallery scene changes that way. And I argue in my book that the art is a form of self-consumption largely by the middle class, by the state at one point. A liberal form in its 30s, 40s, it's really a function of liberal consumption. And then it becomes a kind of state consumption in the 50s, 60s, and the Nasser period. And then I think it fragments into the individualism of the art market from the 70s onward. And I think that reflects the choices of art and style that way. Anyway, there's some reactions that way.
Thank you, Dina, for those really interesting comments. So there's a lot to comment on. I don't really know exactly where to start, but this idea of 1967 as a disease, and I guess a little different than Patrick in that I guess I'm really interested in the form of the artwork, and maybe I would call myself more of a formalist in that sense, but I think both in Ghazviya's work and in El-Ghazal's work, I think the disease is earlier than 1967. This kind of the breakdown of the picture plane into these kind of these like the grids and the cityscapes and these Ghazal's magical technology kind of at that time I think they represent a disillusionment and a deconstruction of that very clear formal style of the earlier period. And so for me, 1967 is it represents the breaking point, but I think that the process to get there had started much earlier because of these issues of the High Dam. They were all sent down to see the High Dam and depict it and depict the people. And I think maybe it had the adverse. Instead of celebrating, which is what the government wanted them to do by going down there and painting and depicting these people, they were actually disillusioned or critiquing what was happening through their artwork. So I think that's a really interesting interesting way to think about 1967. And the familial structure, that's not something that I think thought about before, but thank you, Dina, for that, because there's something, that even talking to Desbia, she got married because she kind of felt it was like socially necessary for her to get married, and then she was connected to this person by the society, by the state, who was then ripped away from her by that same society and state. So that kind of, I need to think a little bit more about how that works in the art, but that's a really intriguing way to think about it, especially with the unsustainability of women as nation. And I think, yeah, that form really, again, through the 60s, really decreases and just numerically, is not as apparent as it is in the earlier stages.
Go ahead. Yeah. No, I think another range too. Thinking about the sense of crisis, what happened to this generation. I think you see a difference between someone like, I mentioned, I started with Abdullah Larawi and his position. And I think if you look at someone, I was mentioning at breakfast about Tahar Labib, a friend of mine who's very helpful to me, who was working here in Beirut just until recently, as an Arab sociologist with a broad interest in art. He's of that same generation, and I think he has a much more optimistic view today of struggle. And he's elected to leave Beirut and went back to Tunis quite recently. And he is an inspiration to a generation, having lived through the repression of the regime. Tahar is an inspiration to students in the arts, in sociology and studies, to think about engaging yourself on how to resist during an authoritarian period that he lived through in the 70s and 80s and 90s, right? And I think he's more optimistic than someone like Larawi is today. I don't know, he's, of the two. And I think would be that same generation if you looked ahead, and I think he would be encouraging in the arts of students, using the arts to interpret problems, whether it's today or looking at historical problems of formation that way. In that sense, very interesting figure that way.
Are there mics available, or do you just want to shout? Oh, there isn't one. No? Yeah.
Well, this is very interesting. I think the notion of rupture is very appropriate because what this did is, I'm an artist and I also teach art at NYU, and we've been through lots of wars and out of Lebanon and then back to Lebanon and searching constantly for identities and Arab identity and foreign influences, etc. But I do remember at the age of 7, 1967, when there was some kind of problem with, I don't know, Israel, I guess, in Egypt and stuff, and the air raids, and then covering our windows with blue stuff. And I remember that was a rupture from our childhood, that being brought up very sheltered and thinking, everything's so nice and, school and coming back and not realizing, even as a middle class kind of person, that, people would go crazy and wars are real and, air raids kind of make everything shake. So it is a rupture, I think, for artists who have a certain sensitivity and who have a certain kind of intellect to be surrounded by sort of politics and having their sensitivities invaded by ugly realities. And so they do react in a way that they have to adjust also to changing trends and moving into abstraction and international arts. And so whether it's 50 years ago or 200 or 500 years ago or 10 years to come, I guess it's only normal that, they would react that way as adjusting to their societies, to their inner needs, to their awareness, to their sensibilities, and, So rupture is probably very appropriate because it probably did kind of pose a threat to them, all the political things, to their spirits, to their identities, to their questions about life and death and existential and all that. So, I mean, we've been in and out of lots of wars here. We have lots of people, so maybe not all of them artists, but I do guess also artists have to adjust to changing trends, fashions, different things, and possibly even identity or spiritual concerns. So rupture is very, very appropriate as a topic.
I think you're right. The rupture is a sense of crisis and response. I mean, in Egypt, for instance, how you see the reaction by the state to this period of crisis. How is it that Egyptians could allow Nasser to stay in power after a defeat, right? And yet he remains in power until his death. And so the closing of power around the central figure that way, and what that means for other aspects of society, or culture, and the arts, and how artists react to that centralization that way. Why does the society allow a defeated ruler to stay in power in this way? And I think the rupture reflects itself in the crisis the artists in the 70s show, all these sculptures of prisoners and scenes of struggle, almost existential kind of sculptural forms, Al-Agati and others in that period, or Zakaria Zaini's paintings through the 80s criticizing. There's lots of ways to look at this problem of rupture in the following way. And I'm sure you have analogies, whether it's Lebanon or Syria or wherever state we're looking at that's affected by it.
Yeah, Lebanon is constantly, nobody's satisfied with the politics here. And the fact that from family to family, it's almost like an inherited status that people go into power. But I guess also the ideas of capitalism and communism, because communism was around, means they were questioning, also, like in the old ages, artists used to work together and used to, build and construct together, and capitalism and the identity, the individual, the name of the artist, that's kind of also part of capitalism and all that sort. And also an Arab country where probably education was not available to everyone. Even today, there's a lot of poverty still. So, there's a certain kind of politics in Arab countries that has not been resolved yet. So, we're sort of still in that phase, if you like, just like 50 years later or something. So, it's not over till it's over. I don't know, I'm very pessimistic, but.
Can I just comment on that before you feel? I think what I really liked about both of these papers, though, is they sort of pushed us to question this idea of rupture as focusing on one moment when everything changed, and sort of assuming that before that none of this was in the works. And I think that that's actually, for me, the most productive thing from both of these papers is the ways in which they deconstruct a narrative that focuses on a specific moment as a moment of breakage. And I think that's, I think that's something we're going to see over the next 2 days, is the ways in which so many of these historical narratives, whether it's with something like 67 or with the idea of the Nahda, take particular moments and sort of highlight them as the moments of tremendous change, but as if nothing pre-existed that change, right? So I just wanted to sort of speak to the fact that that was, for me, one of the most powerful things about the papers. Alex, did you want to say something?
If there are any questions.
Thank you for these really interesting papers, and I guess I just wanted to follow up on an example or some of the examples that Patrick was showing in relation to Gilles Seguini. And what strikes me about some of these traits is the way in which he makes it both readable as a critique in a sense, and not by detaching the letters, for example, so it's a bit harder to read, or using this kind of folk art idiom, which is both familiar and sort of safe in terms of critique, but also then used to have this sort of critical stance. And I'm wondering, you also mentioned you threw a lot of trays in the Nile at some point. What was the response to these works? Were they read as being critical? Were they read as being critical and therefore ignored as a result? Or, I guess I'm interested in, this is partly the topic of my paper, so it's I'm interested.
Yeah, he's a complex figure. I wish I had more psychology background to explain what, this moment of disillusion, he's just desolate and despair. I mean, he tosses these in. Apparently he'd been refused a commission. He wanted a museum. He saw museums being built for Mukhtar and others. He thought maybe I should have a collection. Apparently, according to the monograph we have, it's really not well explained why he did that. But it's just it's an example of a personal crisis, right? And so that's another direction to take it in. I think he's a more conflicted figure than Alcazar or Siri. I don't think he's very consistent in his positions, either politically or in some of his stances. I still think he's very provocative, and he's certainly not something you're going to find in Khan al-Khalili, when you look at brass trays there, right? He's making sure you get the message, if you will. So he's still an interesting figure in this period.
I guess my interest is less in his psychology and more in the kind of response, like were there reviews written of this work? Did people comment on it in the press?
I don't remember. There were some reviews. There were some articles and reviews on him afterward, but I don't. He was actually pretty well known. He was actually I take it back. He was showing quite a bit in earlier in the early 50s. He was getting exhibitions and pretty good publicity in newspapers and so forth. But by this period, he's as far as I know, he's not showing up in the media. Certainly coverage of reviews you would get in Al-Ahlam or other weeklies, but as opposed to earlier periods where he was getting photographs of them opening an exhibition during the earlier Nasser period, right? So I think, probably a direction one could go on him on that.
Thank you for very exciting papers. They open a lot of thought-provoking. They open up for a lot of questions. But here's something, Patrick, you just said. Why would they let a failed president still in power? Was it? And I'm thinking about the comments that we just heard about today's idea. But was there not more of a sort of self-implication as well? I mean, was this seen as Nasser's failure? Was it more of a collective failure? Because the ramification of that moment was not just for Egypt. It was, and in fact, it had. Interestingly, we'll see in the other papers how it resonated in each country in different ways and the endurance of that moment. So was there any of that in the art of whether Gasbia or the other artists that you were seeing? Was there any sort of self-implication in that moment of failure?
Self-implication, like Gasbia taking
some responsibility? Were the artists at all feeling any responsibility towards that failure, or was it seen as Nasser's failure for them? I mean, clearly with the leading up to that moment, not just that moment, the disillusionment with the notions that Nasser had introduced started much earlier than 1967, as you demonstrated. So, but where were they thinking of themselves? I asked this because particularly in the 50s, there was a lot of literature about artists' responsibility as members of society, or as sort of, pedagogically leading into a more national construction, blah, 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 So in that sort of, rhetoric, where did they think of themselves in terms of this breaking down?
I know just in the case of Gasbia, I had this one really fabulous interview with her, but she didn't even mention 67, and she told me about all of these travels that she had had, and the time in prison, and she made friends with all the prisoners, and it was like this really important experience for her. And she didn't mention 67, she didn't mention Nasser, this was not part of the narrative that she has built for herself to explain her art. So anyway, I mean, that doesn't mean that that's the end all be all, you know, analysis of her, but I think, you know, personally for her that didn't, even though we have this one painting that seems to really just like say, this is a 1967 painting in response to the war, it just kind of screams it, the grief painting. It didn't seem like she had incorporated that into a larger narrative of her career. So that's, does that answer your question?
I think there's also a kind of anarchistic tradition in Egypt among the arts. I mean, this Ramses Hunan is the example of that. I mean, of course, he's just died, but he was the writer of this period. And I think the sort of disengagement of the state as Nasser on the artist is maybe disconnected from the political reality of the hegemony of the Khazar class that takes power. And so maybe the artists, I think, are really quite disenfranchised from that and went through a personal disillusion with that. And I think Assaghini was more connected to the contemporary art group and that kind of discourse of really kind of an open anarchist position. And they're quite removed from the larger kind of hegemony that the state drives with the personality of Nasser. I think, though, you do see I think what you're getting at, too, is you do see this detachment and withdrawal representing Nasser individually that way.
Yeah, and then in the case of, Ghazar, so he paints Al-Misaq in 62, and he wins a big state prize for it. He's on TV, Nasser gives him a medal, all these things. But then in 1965, he paints a really big painting called Peace, Sudan. So, you know, I think it's a very pacifist, very international, humanist kind of painting, and it doesn't have the straightforward nationalistic supporting the state. It's more, and at that time, you know, the talk of the war really, the talk of preparations for war really presaged the war itself, right? So I'm not a huge expert on this, but there was a lot of talk of war before the war actually happened, and so to paint a painting called Peace in this, you know, nationalistic, Arab nationalism, bellicose kind of attitude, I think that perhaps, again, that's another statement against the state that he used to paint for, so.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way to look at it.
This is a question for either of you or both of you. I know from Annika's work in Syria that there were a lot of debates among the artists and the press and in the art school during this period around abstraction as like a formal theoretical language, and I was wondering if either of you could just kind of give a cursory map of those debates if they were happening in Cairo at the time, and sort of different takes on them.
This is something I need to research. So I know the Ghazar and a lot of these artists were experimenting. So I know the artistic archive. I know the paintings and the sketches and the drawings and everything, but I haven't yet accessed the discourse about it. So actually, I'm not too sure. But maybe time knows.
Yeah, this is really this is really an interesting problem in Egypt. Why is abstraction somewhat delayed in a certain sense compared to maybe Syria at the time? And someone like Hunan is interesting as a transitional figure because he moves from experimenting in surrealism to absolute rejection of surrealism because the Eurocentric link with the crisis of Israel forces him to kind of re-examine himself as a surrealist. And then when he comes back, then he works in exile in Paris for some time as a journalist. But when he comes back in the early mid-60s, right? I can't remember, it was 62 or something like that. He turns to abstraction and becomes an abstractionist, and really doesn't get very much review when he comes back. He has to keep writing articles in the arts. So there's a certain tentative reception, I think, to abstraction in Egypt that would be an interesting comparative problem with, say, Syria or elsewhere. And of course, I mean, obviously we know, whether this plays into like someone like Serge Gilboa's type of work on why abstraction in certain countries or not. I think that's a very open, interesting question.
But at least in the case of both Syria and Ghazar, the abstract work is definitely marginalized. So Ghazar has a lot of abstract paintings from the not in the museum. And they're generally not reproduced in a lot of publications, especially today. And also, Siri, everyone says, oh, I like her early work. And then when she becomes more of an abstract painter, that work is less desirable. If you look to the art market today, it doesn't sell as well as the earlier work, things like that. So in the history, it's been marginalized for whatever reason.
What about at the time? Do you know anything about?
At the time?
Yeah.
The 1960 Venice Biennial, they were making, so Gazar, I know more about him, and his dealings with abstraction were earlier, and he was living in Italy, and he was making abstract paintings in Italy, and then they were exhibited at this biennial show that was mostly abstract painting, but then when he came back 2 years later, in 1962, and painted this extremely figural, almost social realist painting, Al-Misaq. So there's definitely maybe two different, markets, code of words, markets, and networks that he's responding to in those sense. So again, I don't know about the discourse per se, but his movements in terms of what he was painting and where he was painting definitely show that there were maybe two different kinds of discourses that he's speaking to in two different places.
The painting of the dam required representational work, and the state invests a great deal in representational works, and they used it for the exhibitions. They bring diplomats to try to get funding for the project, etc. So there was a certain need for, that's what I call it, kind of state consumption of art at the time that directed this kind of painting. It doesn't mean it wasn't abstract. There were exhibitions of abstract art, and even open displays going back to the 50s. It got subordinated in the discourse for interesting reasons that we have to work out more.
I have one question. Thank you very much. Then I enjoyed both papers immensely. I have a question for both of you. The rupture of 1967. Do you think that from looking at moving from figuration to abstraction, that underlined a greater questioning of identity and self, and the way in which we construct and know ourselves, thereby creating the epistemological paradigmatic shift, the way that we come to know, the way that authoritarian state discourse imposes this knowledge of ourself and our identity.
I think definitely in the case of Gazar, his early work with the contemporary art group is very focused on being an Egyptian and identifying as an Egyptian modern artist and developing a specifically Egyptian, un-Western modern art practice. And he was involved with other artists like Hamid Nada and Samir Afey and Hussein Yusuf Amin to construct this specifically Egyptian identity for himself. And then towards the 60s, he begins to see himself more as an international artist, and he becomes very into outer space with the rise of space travel and the space race. And this becomes a really prevalent theme in his work, which is, of course, not in Egypt. Egypt was not going, even though they did have plans for a space station. Someone drew up some plans for urban planning for Egypt that would include a space station for Cairo. I saw a presentation where they discussed that. But anyway, so maybe perhaps there was an idea that Egypt would be eventually part of the space race, but at that time this was an international Cold War era phenomenon, and he saw himself as reacting to that, and so perhaps his identity changing from a specifically Egyptian artist and really dedicated to that to more of an international artist. So thank you for that question, very interesting.
Yeah, I think too the emphasis on identity and alienation of the individual, you see that in the 70s a lot. I was thinking when we were coming in, Ahmed al-Satuhi's al-Sajin, the prison, you see Muhammad al-Alawi's works on Jidran, the walls, the individual struggling against being imprisoned in the walls. That's very much a 70s kind of sculptural representation we see. And that would be a whole different direction than I think anything we saw in the 60s. And then you see another kind of direction in the 80s even. And there's other examples like that. Al-Nagati's sculptures, alienation, almost against the state, the individual against the state.
Yeah, just to continue with this question of Gatsby's abstraction, I appreciate that your paper didn't do this, but just to phrase it this way, if one sees the abstraction as a result of the falling away of those other discourses of optimistic socialism, it turns the abstraction into the kind of resource of disillusionment. You're right, I appreciate you not doing that. But could you say it's, I'm presuming Gatsby herself doesn't see it that way. I mean, she obviously sees her, it's like when they say to Woody Allen, I prefer your earlier work when you were funny, obviously. She thinks that she thinks that what she's doing has great value. So could you say a little bit more about that kind of abstraction as, in terms of how she sees it not within the politics of the city?
Right, so I was speaking with Claire yesterday about also how this idea that abstraction is sad, that, oh, we had this trauma, now we can't bring ourselves to depict people anymore, and so abstraction is this kind of sadness or this loss, when of course, in the first painting that I showed, the blues and the oranges, it's not, grief and the paintings from '67 do have a sadness about them, but the abstraction in and of itself is not an aesthetic kind of practice. It can be very rich, and she's very, very colorful and beautiful in the abstraction, just as she is in the figurative painting. So again, I'm challenging this idea of 1967 as the turn to abstraction because of a trauma. I think that it's a longer process, and it wasn't because of some psychological shift to something that was missing something. I don't think that she would say that anything in that later work was missing. I think it's just as, especially through the 70s, they seem just as full. But they, the message, the clarity of the message in her work is just not there in that abstraction. There's a real clarity in those big female figures that still speak to people, and I think perhaps that's why people still say, oh, I like her early work, because it's still, you can still see that she's really saying something and it's very clear, whereas the abstraction makes it a little, if she does have a message, it's less clear. But thank you for that point.
Abstraction is like a rupture from the real world.
Sure.
Like an escape to that otherness or that sort of transcendence
Mm-hmm.
in a way that makes you define spirituality as real, and yet like sort of escaping from the ugliness of whatever you don't want to face and creating another world that could have this possibly ideal creation as sort of another level of reality. So, it's just, just a different way. That's a process, and it's not so clear.
Mm-hmm.
Because also the artist is probably searching to understand through creation, and often if you sort of get away from depicting the real, you get into another world that's like listening to abstract music, or just music that has words, and like the jazz that's just about rhythms and expressing the liveliness of the livelihood of these people, or creating a song that has definite lyrics that's expressing sadness or politics or poetry of the Nile, or maybe the Nile was so beautiful before and it got invaded by these horrible machines, and then all of a sudden it had a kind of aspect to it that could be like cartoons or something, and that, or possibly that sort of figure that was that black figure of a woman crouching, kneeling, or sort of diagonally over a city that's like full of old buildings, and that could be very symbolic. It should be like the inner poetry of transcendence that's creating this abstraction as a way to understand the reality, and her own reality, her body reality, and the reality of the place she came from, or where she was going, or connecting to it.
Okay, I think we have time for just one more question before we end the session.
Let's do two, Jennifer and Sal.
Okay, sorry, yeah.
Minus 2.
Jennifer and then Simon.
Thank you very much for those papers. I enjoyed both of them. But I have a question for Alexandra. I really appreciated your sensitivity to the formal aspects of the painting, and I thought you laid that out really well. And related to that, to me, looking at the early paintings, you noted kind of similarities to Matisse and Rivera and Safavid manuscripts. But one thing you didn't note, and I'm wondering if you see it or if I'm imagining things, is to me there is something kind of natively Egyptian about it. I mean, the kind of strict profiles of the figures reminded me a lot of ancient Egyptian art. The kind of outline of the eyes reminded me of Coptic art, which would of course fit very well with the kind of nationalist sentiment. And I was wondering if that's something that you've explored at all or see at all, because I mean this is very typical for nationalist artists to call on the ancient past.
Sure. Yeah. So many artists of this period, but especially earlier, the earlier like Mahmoud Mokhtar, Mahmoud Said, Reza Bayed, Nagy, they were very much interested in incorporating indigenous folk art, but also ancient Egyptian. Of course, Mokhtar being the preeminent example of this, really seriously incorporating pharaonic motifs and blending them with a modern style. So.
Do you see that with her work, though?
So,
I mean,
and then
some of it, it's not as direct. It's a little more subtle, but just these figures.
Yeah, and I think she and a lot of her colleagues during this time were very adamant about creating a unique style that incorporated both these academic. I mean, clearly she was trained as an academic oil painter on canvas. That's her medium. But she was also incorporating. So when I say Matisse, it reminds me of Matisse or Safavid painting. I have no idea if she looked at Matisse.
Right.
I highly doubt she was looking at Safavid painting. But to me, those are what those flat planes remind me of, and I kind of use that as to explain the painterly technique that she was using. However, I think that she was looking to a lot of things and probably focusing more on the Egyptian Egyptian styles. And Ghazal was looking to the popular folk art traditions of the city, and Hamed Nada, another artist of the same period, was also incorporating pharaonic motifs, but in a very mediate. He changed it. You can see it, but he changed it a lot. Yeah, so it's very much more subtle than the earlier period. But thank you for pointing that out because it's an important part of identifying as an Egyptian artist at that period.
Great, thank you.
Thank you for both papers. Actually, they tell us how much more we need to learn and research about this period particularly. I just want to add, maybe contribute some of the information I sort of gleaned from Gazibiya Sirri, interviewing her in the late 80s, mid 90s, and more recently, a year or 2 years ago. And I have the feeling that she always emphasized that she's had it with Jamal Abdel Nasser, particularly after her husband's imprisonment. And to her, it seemed that was the point of rupture a few years before the '67 war, whereby she wanted from that point on to assert her own personality, her own style, unique, like you mentioned earlier. That seemed to resonate more and more when I remember her work and her emphasis on her own unique style. Later in the 80s, when I interviewed her, she was trying to get a scholarship to have the artist residency in Washington, D.C. Yeah. And it was during that period where there was a shift from this kind of grid to the more sort of abstract figurative style of the shapes, of the woman shapes or the figure shapes of that period. But the other point I want to make is that she was working with this group of artists or influenced by this group, and I think she mentioned a few times that she's had enough of that. She wanted to go on her own. And also in the 80s, she did these large paintings with large gestural strokes, putting the canvas on the floor. And these were excellent examples also. And going back to your comment, Patrick, about the fact that the Egyptian artists were behind, they were behind, I think, as well, the Lebanese, more than the Syrians. more Lebanese were doing abstract art of that period than Syrians. And the Egyptians, you're right, they were maybe a decade behind or so from several Lebanese artists. So that's something we should, I think, look further into that period and look at this whole geography, particularly when we know of the influence of the Lebanese in literature going back much earlier and looking at parallels between both. Thank you very much.
I shouldn't have said they're behind. That's a bad choice of words. It's a choice of form and style. Either way, it should be stated.
Well, thank you to both our presenters and to all of you for your wonderful questions, and we will return after lunch. Thank you.